All right, welcome back, everyone. It is October 10th, 23, and we're in our first discussion on Chapter 2. So, before we jump into any questions or anything, what is anyone's just takeaway from Chapter 2, or what were they curious about, or what's something that kind of remains with them after reading? Feel free to just raise your hand or just go for it.
Hi, it's Pablo here. In the page 35, action has a epistemic value and pragmatic value brings rewards. So that for me, for what I'm building, is super important. So yeah, I have also some other notes and a question over there we can cover later. So yeah, for me, this is like my pick on this.
Awesome. Yes, the idea that we don't have to coerce epistemic value or learning or information gain into utility. We don't have to like convert it into utility in order for that policy to be selected. Key aspect. Any other favorite quotes or fun parts of Chapter 2, or parts they woke up sweating about, or anything?
For me, tying this back to the surprise and maybe elaborating on what encompasses policy. I mean, I'm putting strategy in there, but I don't know if that's correct specifically in the low road.
Cool. Like, policy enumerates the possibilities for action over a given time horizon, but strategy isn't just enumerating branching paths. So then what is strategy? Great questions. Any other just random Chapter 2 thoughts?
You know, when it comes to this idea of planning as inference, something that I've been just kind of thinking about a lot lately is that ultimately when I do something, and the best example is just trying to walk somewhere, all I really do is to hold a conscious intention to be somewhere. And then I'm kind of out of the loop other than having, processing sensory evidence that I'm actually getting there. And as long as that's happening, I can sort of see this loop in my brain where I'm going and just enjoying myself looking at things and just thinking all kinds of other thoughts and so on and so forth. And the going kind of happens on its own. All I really do is to have a conscious intention. I don't even necessarily have to feel my body as it's moving. If I get into this state almost like almost like a walking meditation, then it really feels like, being in a self-driving car. So it's kind of interesting that I'm starting by understanding all of this stuff, like having a generative model to notice these things in my own awareness. I'm starting to notice these things in my own awareness, and I'm starting to be, not only have these ideas confirmed mathematically, but also experientially. So this is just a little bit weird, but really fun.
Awesome. Cool. And also no amount of propositional intention to walk. You can think as hard as you want, I want to walk, but then actually the intention that gets you out of the chair is something different. So what does that mean, or what does that have to do with action?
Yeah, and but so you have to sort of distinguish different kinds of intention. So like there's the intention as in kind of like, it would be nice if, or like wishful thinking, I wish I could do this. But what I mean by intention is a very specific mental state. And that mental state is usually not available to you unless you start training in meditation, where it becomes obvious that it exists. So it's something that, like, if you think about, like, everything about this from the perspective of training a neural network for a robot to do something. So, robot will have some kind of goal in a neural network, getting to a place or whatever. So it must be some kind of activation in the neural network that's going to be triggering a sequence of other activations, right? Or a bunch of activations that are going to go through some kind of cycle in time, that sort of thing. And normally that's an unconscious thing, but I don't think it has to be so. And like the Buddhist meditative practices, particularly insight meditation, they specifically distinguish the intention. So at some point you might become aware that, like, first they have an intention to move the hand, then they have a feeling of moving the hand. So as I'm holding the intention and I'm getting the sensory input to confirm that what I intended is happening. And that process is actually it's possible to introspect. It's possible to see it in your own awareness, and that's wonderful, really.
Awesome. Any other opening thoughts from people? Just some low road or chapter 2 thought or something that they're excited about to explore a little bit today. Cool.
The getting a little deeper into what is learning versus inference.
Yeah, multiple time scales that computational models of cognition play out on. The fastest sometimes being called inference, the kind of rapid fire neural spiking type, a little bit slower attention with the precision weighting, stepping on the gas, pulling off the gas, and then a little bit slower even learning. Sometimes the whole process is called inference. Sometimes inference is only being used to refer to the kind of like crack of the whip, most rapid time scale. But what is learning, the higher order phenomena, like a child learning how to read? How do we connect that with a more narrow statistical concept of learning? Like we learned that the average height of the tree in the forest was 10 feet, but previously we thought it was 9. So that's learning.
So is that the same as belief updating?
What would anyone else say? What is the relationship between learning and belief updating?
I'm curious about if this system is deterministic or it's more on the free will side, and or none at all.
Are you saying about the belief updating or about the active inference?
About the active inference.
Okay.
I like to joke that free will, you have free will only so far as that you're free to suffer. If you really understand that you're not a thing, that you're a process and you're totally interdependent with everything else, then the best thing to do is always to be a free energy minimizing agent and do it in an optimal way. If you're not doing that in an optimal way, that will cause some friction or suffering.
We can jump to this cohort 5 question that's kind of related. And then yeah. Oh, go ahead. Who was that? Oh, okay. Sorry. Oh yeah, Ali, go for it.
Okay, so the relation between belief updating and learning is that the belief updating is much more general than just learning. So both inference and learning involve belief updating in some sense. And this is one of the probably most confusing things about active inference modeling, because most people, when it comes to learning, they only think of belief updating as applied to only the learning side of active inference. But then Bayesian belief updating can be applied to both inference side and the learning side. So they use the exact same kind of belief Bayesian belief updating mechanism. So we'll see how it works in relation to both more explicitly chapter 6.
Yeah. The faster inference scale is kind of like you have the calculator preloaded, like the weights in the neural network are fixed, if you want to think of it that way, or the parameters are kind of like preloaded and preset. And then inference is like new argument comes in, new input comes in, and it just is like a plug and chug. That's the faster inferential scale, which can still result in a belief updating. And then learning is actually the change on those weights, or like the change in that system, how it's set up, so that it influences future rounds of fast inference.
So in that respect, it's almost like what Christoph was saying vis-a-vis intentionality prior to a generative model, where learning is changing those parameters, prior to having the generative model, being able to update that intentionality, which then the belief updating happens in relation to.
Perhaps learning could be like, what kind of thing am I? And then the faster inference is like, given the thing I am, how do I respond? And then the kind of general theme is, instead of evaluating sense making or decision making in terms of like maximally rewarding, they're cast in terms of most likely. So instead of given what I value, what's the most rewarding, it's like, given the generative model, what's the most likely outcome? And then in chapter 9, we'll look at, given what empirically did happen, what's the most likely generative model? So that's the kind of scientific, like behavioral researcher, going from the data to the most likely model. And then the other direction is from the model generating the most likely data. And both of them are they're just two directions on the same freeway. All right, let's look at this question, and then anyone else can like add a question to the table, or write another question in the chat. Okay. This means that free will is part of the model. Question. Point 2.3. The interplay of top-down and bottom-up processes distinguishes the inferential view from alternative approaches that only consider bottom-up processes. Okay. Probably a lot that could be explored here. What does anyone want to kind of bring in here or say about this section?
Yeah, that was my question. So yeah, my thought was, if it's bottom up, it would be deterministic. Everything is around. It's getting like you are just like observing and just getting the data in, and you probably won't have much action on that, or your agency, I think we call it. And if you is top down, it means that I have an agency. I'm deciding. I'm modeling the world that surrounds me. And yeah, that was my question, my thought, and something that I care. It's very philosophical as well, I think, and yeah.
Anyone have a thought on this? Yeah, Andrew?
This is Andrew. When I hear this question, I just want to recommend Eric Howell's new book. I forget what it's called right now. Sorry, I'm multitasking as usual. But he talks about how those, I think the active inference is completely congruent with his theory of causal emergence, which talks about how you can have bottom-up processes and top-down, and still have some room for free will in between, with just mechanistic rule-following behavior. And so I feel like there's room for the philosophy to still exist within a non-dualist approach to metaphysics.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, yeah, thank you. That makes sense.
If I may add a little bit, you know, I think it's interesting to consider here sort of Stephen Wolfram's principle of computational equivalence. So Wolfram, based on his experience with computation, says that essentially there is a level in the computational ladder of sophistication, and it's actually pretty low. It's incredibly low. That once you hit it, you're as sophisticated computationally as any other agent. So even if you had a completely computationally deterministic system where everything is fixed, like the universe, there is absolutely no way you're going to be able to properly predict, outcompute even the simplest agents, like simplest cellular automata and so on, because they are effectively as computationally sophisticated as you are. So that gives always rise to uncertainty. It's a built-in feature that you will not be able to compute the perfectly a model of internal states, and this comes up in active inference modeling, the difficulty of constructing these generative models. But it seems to a fundamental principle of nature that's impossible. So as an agent, you know, if you're as an agent, you're kind of a controller for future states. You have an intention that you want to achieve a future state, and you're trying to sort of get there. But the world that you're trying to control is never going to be simply deterministically following rules. So there's going to be resolution of some uncertainties. And I think that resolution of uncertainties, that gives the rise to the feeling of free will. The underlying system might be completely deterministic, but the experience of it from within a part of it embedded in the system, it's always, we can feel that I had these choices because I always had some uncertainty.
Cool.
Yeah, that. Yeah. That's another thing that Steve Wolfram. It's I always wonder how these two currents are gonna cross over. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I suspect on a machine learning street talk with Karl and Stephen in the coming months, we'll see though. That should be quite interesting. Ollie and then Susan.
Okay, so when it comes to agency, I suppose active inference kind of assumes that any lifelike property, including agency and many other things, they're kind of inherent to, and also they're emergent property of any dynamical non-equilibrium system. And more often than not, these systems are ergodic, and also they possess Markov blankets. So in other words, FEP supposes that organisms have this goal of keeping themselves in their expected states, or more precisely, their expected phenotypic and ontogenetic states. And consequently, they act to minimize the discrepancy between the desired or predicted state of affairs and the one that they experience. So to quote Friston himself, it furnishes an account of basic or biotic sentient behavior that places agency center stage. So I believe active inference and FEP is not a deterministic theory of cognition at all, because as I just quoted Friston, it takes agency very seriously, and even at the very center stage of the theory.
Thank you, Ollie. Susan?
I kind of to tie on that and and pose a question in terms of agency. I kind of question whether we recognize without learning our requisite limits, which is kind of what I interpreted what you were talking about. People go over their requisite limits all the time. It's called anxiety. It's called, schizophrenia, whatever. But this has kind of got me thinking that the agency and the affordances is kind of a chicken and egg problem. It's like, as I update, as I find more freedom, which, freedom to choose. And in fact, when I heard the intention, it was like, well, I have a choice of other intentions. So that's going to cascade down. That's basically agency, but I still have to, so the belief updating or learning, is going to show me new affordances, but then I need new agency to be able to do something else with that affordance. So, so is it kind of a chicken and egg problem, or how does that play out in this model?
A few narrow points, but first, Ali, please.
Yes, actually, there is some conceptual overlap of the FAP with the kind of ecological psychology viewpoint offered by Walsh in terms of affordances. So Walsh argues that if an agent has a goal, it will experience its environment as a kind of menu of affordances. What's in its surroundings and whether they're useful or not for attaining that particular goal. So the environment-agent interaction might be regarded as a kind of landscape that should be navigated to that given end. So in effect, what it says is it posits a kind of optimization problem in which one might expect efficiency to play a role in determining that trajectory. So that's basically the overlapping between the formulation of FEP and this ecological psychology viewpoint, or at least Walsh's formulation of Gibsonian affordances, because in both of those cases, there's this bilateral interaction between the environment and the agent. So as to the chicken egg problem, it cannot really be separated from each other. So there's this continual bilateral interaction between those two.
Cool. Yeah, just two narrower points. So Pablo kind of kicked the soccer ball off with this question about bottom up and top down. And these generative models are as constructed. So we could imagine a top down constraining force that's just always it's always clamping the same way. Or it's alternating between two different top-down impositions. So just the mere presence of top-down forces does not support or reject in the system of interest itself the presence or absence of free will defined as someone chooses. But by comparing a portfolio of models, it might be possible to garner evidence or kind of come to favor one of those choices more. And similarly, the information coming bottom up could be generated deterministically. It could be an oscillator, or it could be generated probabilistically, like being drawn from a distribution. And that could drive belief updating in the agent in a non-linear way or in a linear way. So it's like sometimes these adjectives that modify the probabilistic internals of the model, deterministic, probabilistic, all of that, there's a lot of richness, but also openness in how they articulate with the broader philosophical questions. Like Robert Sapolsky's current book, or it's coming out in some days or something like that, it's called Determined, the Science of Behavior or Living Without Free Will. So it's like deterministic sounds like it's going to be addressing the exact same question that Sapolsky is going to be addressing. But then, as Christoph pointed to, even a deterministic system of quite limited sophistication, the only way to predict its behavior may be to play it out. This is kind of like Turing's halting problem. Like, even if you're an expert in programming, you look at a piece of code, you may not be able to know a priori whether it's going to halt or how it's going to act. And then again, to this kind of like more limited generative models have a zone of surprisal around them, but the zone of surprisal with respect to the modeler isn't the same thing as a truth claim about the system. You could make an example where the affordance landscape is fixed, like the rat in the T-maze that we'll see later. But a real rat in a T-maze might discover a new affordance. Like, it might find out it could roll over and, you know, knock something over. And then if it has that capacity to learn, that could be modeled as like expanding its E variable, like expanding its repertoire of affordances, and then it might come to select those. So then but the fact that a given generative model does or doesn't have the ability to expand its repertoire of affordances, the real rat on the ground, just because the model can't doesn't mean the rat can't. Just because the model does doesn't mean the rat will. So that's the kind of iterated, continued engagement and repeated modeling as a way to develop hypotheses to re-enter the system of interest with action, not to just make version 1 of the generative model and shut the door on the question. Cool. Well, what's another question or section that somebody wants to look to?
I'd really like to capture what you just said about the rat. That was prolific.
Oh, mammals. Let's look at some classic questions. There's a lot here, but does anyone want to just ask one just that comes to mind now, or something they scribbled in a margin? Yeah, Inks, and then yeah, Inks first, and then Andrew.
Yep.
So, considering the difference between model and process, I'm still very far behind all of you guys. So I was thinking the model doesn't have to be true, right? It's subjective. It has to work. It doesn't have to be true. Does the process have some limit? Like, do we know absolute truth on the X asterisk, the hidden state that is asterisk as part of the process? I'm thinking that, connecting that to, I don't know if you guys have read Greg Egan's Shield's Ladder, where they discover by mistake, through an experiment, they trigger a vacuum that is a more stable state than our vacuum, and it starts unrolling through the universe the way Einstein does in Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. So I was thinking, like basically inventing more and more stable models, they roll out like that, like a carpet through everything, because they're so much easier to survive and persist through. But does, on the process side, the real hidden state, does it have truth? Yeah.
that reminds me of this very short Borges story where this is somebody read chapter 6 a little bit too literally, and they wanted a perfect map, and then it came to, just like you said, Inks, it came to unfurl over the whole territory until it just blurred with the territory. Another answer to that is X star, the generative process, using the way that the textbook talks about it, though Ollie may bring up a very salient point, is still something that's proposed by the modeler. And so X star could be said to have like a local truth. Let's just say we have an air condition turning on or off agent, kind of regular setting like that, thermometer, sense readings, making inference about temperature in the room, taking action to turn on the air conditioner. And then we have like the generative process, which is giving rise to the temperature readings. Now, all of that is like a local constructed truth, but just making some sort of function to describe how temperature plays out in that modeled room. Again, that doesn't mean that the real room has that feature. Ollie?
Yes, there's actually this kind of criticism or debate going on around FEP about whether it's too general to be a realistic scientific model of the agents, or more specifically cognitive agents, because on one hand, it kind of puts everything in a great degree of abstraction, to the extent that it may not be able to answer some concrete questions about the biological or the biological nature of the agent, or the real world situations of the agent. So, for instance, there was this paper by Coloma Palacio from 2021, namely, non-equilibrium thermodynamics and the free energy principle in biology, in which they explicitly put forward this criticism around FEP as being too general to be useful for modeling any real world or concrete biological problems. But on the other hand, FEP never claimed otherwise, because according to the FEP, any or a given non-equilibrium system with a target state would always seek the most efficient route, and this route would typically be the one defined by considerations of the gradient descent, or in other words, the path through all the available configuration space that follows the steepest route to the minimum. So again, in this view, it's not even explicit whether the agency or all the other concepts we're talking about are real or the apparent properties of the agents. So more to the point, I believe FEP and active inference can be more congruent with structural realism view of the philosophy of science, as opposed to just old-fashioned or traditional pure realism or naive realism of view of the science. And in this regard, Friston co-authored some papers with Majid Beni, and they argue for this view of FEP as a kind of view that that is more congruent with the structural realism and particularly ontological structural realism.
Awesome. Christoph?
I just want to say that holding on to any kind of notion of truth, I think the best thing that ever happened to me in my life is I decided that there are no truths. There are just simply models within models within models, and you can sort of see it in the temperature example. Temperature is not real. It's a virtual variable. It's literally what the physicists would call it, right? It's a way of coarse graining all the interactions between gas molecules in such a way that we can measure. So we have something that persists for time that we can observe, but you're never really looking at reality. And if you go down, this rabbit hole, then ultimately you will arrive at something that, like, there is some computational, say Wolfram's perspective on this. I am very fond of that one. There is some computational model that's running all possible computations. So what truth would be in that kind of context would be the shortest description, the shortest possible program that gives rise eventually to what you're observing. But because because everything is kind of like interdependent, you're never going to be able to I think you're never going to be able to separate and say, like, oh, this is the true process that gave rise to this observation. There's going to be some kind of interplay of all kinds of computational processes, all running kind of independently. So insofar as I think this is why there's this difficulty in writing down these generative models of all these possible when we have this probability over priors, because there's absolutely no way to know what these priors will be. We can only make guesses of what the range of these of values can be taken and adapt as evidence as observations are flowing in.
Cool. Also, on this kind of generative model, generative process point, this is one great question. In figure 2.2 and throughout this textbook, pains are made to distinguish the generative model from the generative process. And it is a useful distinction to understand the process that gives rise to the observations, the modeled process that gives rise to the observation. So the kind of like digital niche of this generative model of the agent. And yet, in a guest stream, we saw a slight different perspective, or at least way to talk about this, when Maxwell presented and utilized this bracket to cover the entire generative model, including external states. Again, those that give rise to sensory states. And at this time step in the published transcript, Ali asks this question very specifically. So there's, of course, many ways to speak this or any dialect. But within this textbook, generative process is used to refer to the process external to the agent, the particular states of the agent, blanket and internal. And the external states are described as generative process, giving rise to the observations, and not influencing the actual fundamentals of the particular partition, but rather just using a different natural language to describe it. It is also becoming common to describe the generative model as describing all the necessary and sufficient statements that the modeler makes about the entire scenario, and not distinguishing so much as to what's the generative process in the generative model. One piece of I guess support for like this kind of just use generative model to describe it all. First off, it's simpler. Also, if you have two agents in conversation, then of course one of them is the generative process to the other and vice versa. And so just in the same spirit of like, well, states of the world or aspects of the world, let alone the map, they're not tagged as like sensory or action or internal or external. Those qualifiers are always relative to which node is being called the internal state. And then the rest of the blanket is just trivially assigned from there. So it doesn't make sense to like say, well, this desk is the external state. It's like, well, but it's its own internal state if I chose to model it from that side, or with respect to the wall behind it, it's the blanket state between me and the wall. So using generative model a little bit more broadly seems to be a little bit of a development that has unfolded over the cohorts and years. Susan?
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it, if I, correct me if I'm not looking at it correctly, but when you do research, you have to decide what your ontology or epistemology is going to be when you apply it. And you always provide context for that. So this kind of is above that in my mind. In fact, you and I've had a conversation because I want to make sure that it's ideology free, because I see way too much BS, especially in management science, that is just embedded with somebody's ideology and it's taken as fact. So it's kind of what I like about the model. That brings me to the Markov blanket. And where so in that sense of the model, the generative model, where does the Markov blanket extend? Because it was a little confusing reading it. Is it just confirm for me though? Am I looking at it correctly in terms of it being a heuristic? That's why I posted that in the comments, because that's what I copied from chapter 10, I think.
Cool. Maybe post what page you found it on, but it's a great quote. Features are not intrinsically on the blanket or internal or external. There's a Bayes graph that conveys whatever variables are being included. Whatever quantified aspects are under consideration or formalized, doesn't have to be a number, it could be like categorical, but whatever is being brought, whatever Lego pieces are coming on the table and how those Lego pieces are connected. That's the Bayes graph. And then whatever node or cluster of nodes is being selected as the internal states, the blanket is just all that surround that. And so when we're taking this kind of agentic view or cybernetic view on cognitive ecosystems, then the blanketing states, just to give a first pass, can be understood in terms of sensory data. So anything that you would record with a sensor. And then the outgoing dependencies are actions, anything that would be described by the affordances of an actuator.
So to add, build on what Ink's question was, would the Markov blanket be the same for, if I'm doing, let's say I am doing a research and a modeling project, would I use the same Markov blanket for the process and the model? Or would the process change the blanket? The final model?
Just giving a narrower answer, because I know that's something that could be explored at great depth. If you made a generative model with a fixed Markov blanket, then it would be fixed. If you said our room has a thermometer and an arm that's an actuator, and different data are going to come in and the arm is going to do different things, well then the kind of scheme of the blanket wouldn't change. But you might want to be interested in modeling the transition from that room deciding that it should put out a second thermometer, at which point the scheme of the blanket would change.
Okay.
And then you'd be outside that room, be like, oh, they literally just went from having one thermometer to two thermometers. And then you could postulate cognitive models that happened inside of that room. You'd say maybe it's like they had an affordance to add a thermometer and they selected that affordance.
Does that answer your question better, Inks?
Now I have more questions, but I don't want to stir more trouble here.
What else is the end of a session for other than stirring trouble?
So because you were talking about being in the room, can I just roll with it?
Of course.
You were talking about being in the room and then a second thermometer, and I was thinking of, as an agent, this, I don't think this is about this chapter, but as an agent, as my Markov blanket is like, I'm looking at the screen right now, but then I have a flutter in my heart and I'm like, oh no, am I having a heart attack? And my Markov blanket, is that a separate Markov blanket where now I'm modeling myself very close and tight around my heart? Then I hear the door knock and, oh, I have a package from Ukraine, and I run. Like now my attention slash Markov blanket is all the way my apartment and the door to the outside world where someone is knocking. Are these different? Am I switching between different Markov blankets, or is the Markov blanket moving with my attention regime?
Great question. Well, to the wandering blankets and blankets that are not sort of 1 or 0, but can be on a continuum or a blanket index, certainly some of the most recent work is addressing that. I'll just leave that there. But to the interoception question, in chapter 6, when we're exploring how to construct these generative models, an example of sensor fusion is provided. So let's just say that a given body has some interoceptive sensations like heart rate, and then some exteroceptive sensory capacities like hearing and vision and so on. Those are kind of like all open. Even when you close your eyes, you're still getting visual input. And usually it's modeled not as changes in the blanket, but in changes in attention. Like you still have proprioceptors in your foot, but you're not paying attention to them. You're not attending to them, which is to say, it's as if the data coming from them are not making a difference to belief updating. If you're not paying attention to something, it is not having consequence. Its differences are not making a difference. And then regimes of attention describe the way that in this kind of multimodal setting, the spotlight of attention might focus on a given sensory modality. And so that is usually modeled more as an attention modulation task within a fixed Markov blanket schema, rather than changes to the scheme of the blanket itself. Christoph?
So, this makes me think that having this sort of, explicit model of attention within a fixed Markov blanket, it's really because Markov blanket is a kind of like a convenient, it's an idea, it's a convenient idea for modeling to make this separation, but it's not actually something that is real. That there is any boundary that you can find and say like, yes, this is definitely a boundary between the internal and external states. And this recent work on moving blankets, I think what we're eventually going to realize is that there's just a precision parameter there as well, like how thick I want my Markov blanket to be, and for the convenience of describing certain phenomena at certain temporal scales, it simply makes sense to make an assumption that there is a separation between these internal and external states. But in reality, if you look at it at all temporal scales, you will find that there is the separation is not really there. It's invented. So this, it's kind of like this is the way I sort of understood the Buddhist concept of relativity. Everything is sort of relative, and I put myself in a frame of reference, and I say, well, within this frame of reference, these are internal, these are external states, and then I have and then I have a way of looking at them to make sense of them. If I didn't have the ability, then it might be difficult to be able to make sense of the world if I can't make this partition. But is the partition real? personally, I didn't think so. It's just a point of view.
Thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, a couple of riffs on what's been said. One, like the finding your own Markov blanket, I feel like is a little bit of a hopeless cause, because it's very likely that you are many nested. You contain Markov blankets all the way down, and there's a lot of complex phenomena and interior modeling going on. In terms of coming to grips with that, one resource I'd like to recommend is, if anyone's seen the book The Mind Illuminated by Dr. John Yates. It's kind of a good rationalist take on meditation practice that kind of lets you come to grips with there's probably multiple agentic things happening in your brain. Another thing that was just kind of wow to me that I just wanted to gush about this chapter is I've been trying to sort of come to grips with what normativity means in a sort of non-dualist agentic frame of reference. And there was a couple quotes at the end of this chapter, one of which is, in active inference, the identity of an agent is isomorphic with its priors. That just like, I was like, oh, all right, that kind of puts it all together. And kind of to get that pitched up, they start with, expected states are preferred and include the organism's conditions for survival, e.g. niche specific goal states, whereas their opposite, surprising states, are dispreferred. In this way, by fulfilling their expectations, active inference agents ensure their own survival. So it just, that phenomena, one thing, your Bayesian priors are your normative order, which I've been searching for what does a normative order mean, especially within the context of sort of a small agent trying to find relevance in the cognitive limits of finding relevance there. And I feel like this is the right approach. Also, one more thing, with the free, not variational free energy, but the planning one, expected free energy. We were talking about what sort of the way it includes both epistemic and preference value in the same equation. I feel like as a group, we really need to tackle that as a koan, and realizing that maybe a lot of our preconceptions that we've been grappling with during this meeting are really summed up with understanding that itself, that it all fits both epistemic, ontological in the same sort of optimization framework. So that's just me riffing on this.
Great comments. Equation 2.5 and equation 2.6 are like the heart of active inference. We have the real-time sense making about incoming sense data and beliefs. And then we have the prospective, which not all agents even need to be modeled as doing, the prospective unified imperative for pragmatic and epistemic outcomes. And that's the heart, and that's the mystery, and that's like the part that we don't need to reinvent. And then all the work is in getting it into a form, getting the system of interest into a form where you just press play on those equations. Ali, and then any final comments that people have.
Thank you. Regarding whether or not or to what extent markup blankets are quote unquote real, it's probably worth keeping in mind that markup blankets are more precisely, they're not necessarily spatiotemporal boundaries, but rather they draw boundaries in state space, or in other words, in the space of all possible configurations. It's true that sometimes it manifests itself as a kind of spatiotemporal boundary, such as the cell membranes. But more often than not, we don't need to consider markup blankets as kind of purely physical or spatiotemporal boundaries. So yes, it's a kind of modeling technique, but in terms of its mathematical reality, it is as true as any other mathematical models.
Cool. Well, very fun. The low road. Is it a bumpy road? Is it a smooth road? What is it like? I don't know. But that was our first discussion on it. Next week at the earlier time, we will check back. So it would be epic if people just write in the coming minutes or in the coming week, add a few more questions to chapter 5 questions, or we'll look at the bigger questions table too. In cohort 4, we'll be heading into chapter 8 on continuous time generative models. And we'll have next week on chapter 2, then head into 3. So thank you all. The game goes on. So see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.